Hello, everyone. I want to welcome Briana MacWilliam. She is an attachment and creative arts therapist. And today we are going to do a live follow up regarding a video we did around expressing needs in romantic relationships. And so we had a lot of questions. I got some emails, Briana got comments, and we're going to be answering those questions during this Facebook Live. I will also be monitoring the Facebook group and seeing if there's any comments that we can address or any other questions that we can address during this Facebook Live. And so I'm going to let Briana introduce herself because you guys already know me. Briana, go ahead.
Well, hello, my name is Briana MacWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. And I've been in the field for about 13 years now, and I am just wild about talking about love and relationships, and in particular, helping individuals that struggle with insecure attachment go from feeling kind of stuck and or fearful in their relationships to moving into a place of what I call self-sovereignty. So that they can call in the soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And I usually approach this from a psycho-spiritual perspective through the framework of creative arts interventions and attachment theory.
That's awesome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of, we had this video where Briana and I talked for probably a good hour, 45 minutes about expressing needs, and we got in some really deep, important stuff. And one of the questions that came up in our audience was Briana talked about this inner child work. And there's some people wrestle with their identity about being a people pleaser. And so we're going to kind of dive into that. And so the question is, as I'm doing this inner child work and I come up against this people pleaser identity, who am I without that identity? And I'll have you go ahead and start with that and we'll go from there.
Well, that is the question and the fear that usually generates a tremendous amount of anxiety, right? Because we are feeling disconnected from whatever the inner self may be. And so when I say that I take a psycho-spiritual perspective on things, that's the vernacular that I have for it. But you know, in other areas of study, like in psychology, they might refer to this as the unconscious self. Or you might, wounded inner child is a term that was coined by John Bradshaw, who talks about conditions of love, which people pleasing could be a demonstration of fearing conditions of love. So if I don't give all of myself, then I'm not truly loving. Then I haven't earned love. And then we become reliant upon the response to whatever it is we are giving to mirror back to us our value and our worth. And so then we get confused about, well, what is a need? What is a boundary? And we experience people establishing a boundary as a rejection or as an abandonment because we are sourcing so much of our sense of self from whatever feedback or stimulation we're getting from the environment. And we feel like if I just keep giving, then I will get what I need. And I kind of refer to that as like the martyred syndrome. I give and I give and I give, and yet this is what I get back. And all of that giving in our mind is sort of like a form of earning. It's making up for the not knowing who am I without this giving, right? And also beneath that, a belief that if I'm not giving, then I'm not of any value to anybody. So in some ways, and then there's the dark side of that, which is sometimes we give because we feel like we're in a more of a position of control if we are the one that is giving. And then we close ourselves off from receiving because receiving feels like a form of surrender. It feels like a form of loss of control. Because if you are reliant upon receiving something, then that can be taken away. And it's likely that at some point in your life, it was taken away. So that's where we start talking about conditions of love. That if you are not constantly giving, or you're not constantly molding yourself to the demands and or desires of the people around you, then you are of no value to them and love is taken away from you. But the thing is that when it comes down to it in intimate relationships, your yeses mean nothing without your nos. And your nos are what help to define who and what you are. And when we're talking about inner child work, you know, it's typically that if you find yourself caught in a people pleasing, or I might even add to that rescuer role, then it's usually because at some point the play as a child, like where you start exploring things and deciding what you like and what you don't like by just falling into that natural sort of stream of consciousness and imagination that you witness children having, for some reason that was qualified as inappropriate or too loud or misbehaving or not paying attention or not doing what you're supposed to do. And so we learn how to cut off that flow of beingness and accommodate the world around us. So finding the inner child, or finding the self that you are without all the people pleasing, is really a matter of turning on that imagination again and going back to a place of playfulness and allowing that to flow through you.
And I think so. I kind of want to break this down a little bit. There's a lot of different pieces within this that you just brought to light, and kind of the first one, just as a reflection, is there's this external locus of control, of externalized self-worth. And so part of that people pleasing role is, if I make this other person happy, then I have a sense of worth. But that's where Briana kind of talks about it. It's a bind, because you give, but then when it comes to receiving, since you're so used to always pleasing everyone else, when someone tries to please you, you kind of almost put up an emotional barrier, or you don't want to receive it. And it makes it really hard to have a reciprocal relationship, a relationship where you're giving some, the other person's giving some, you're receiving, they're receiving, something that's really healthy, when you're stuck in that kind of rescuer mode of, I must always please these other people. And as Briana highlighted, that comes from conditioning earlier in childhood. And the key way to start to get out of this and to do some of that inner work is exploring how to set boundaries, to define what is you and what is someone else, what you can and cannot do. Because often what happens, people pleasers, is they are burnt out, they overextend themselves, they are overcommitted to things, and they rarely ask for what they need. And so in regards to our previous video where we talked about expressing needs, this is exactly where it's needed, is you need to understand not only, yeah, your people pleasing is a beautiful thing, but the intention behind it is to validate your self-worth. So it's not really people pleasing. It's actually using someone else's satisfaction of you to validate your self-worth. And so what we want to do is do the deep inner work that allows you to challenge that belief that you must be that way to get love, and lead you to expressing what you need in a relationship, as well as starting to figure out, how do I give in a way that isn't then always evaluated? Does that make sense, Briana? Am I kind of making sense with that?
Sure. I think too, part of it is that oftentimes people pleasers don't know what they need.
Because they're so focused and they've been conditioned to give to other people. They're so focused on what everyone else needs, but they aren't attuned to what they need. And they live that way. That's how they survived up to this point. But it's costing them their relationship. It's costing them being whole in their relationship, which is really that inner work that we're talking about. And one of the questions you had was, who am I without this identity? And I think that's, for me, well, you become actually more of who you are, because you're starting to explore, what do I need? What do I want? Who am I? And you begin to define that. Pleasing other people isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes a bad thing when the intention is to get validation for your self-worth through that, because that's not really pleasing. At least that's not how I see it. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think also, it might be worthwhile sort of teasing out the language, in the sense that, so what if we could switch language of people pleasing to being open and available to your partner, right? Which is a little bit different than just people pleasing. And also, I think the other thing is that when you have someone who has for a long time sourced their sense of self from the approval they receive from the external world, asking them to stop doing that and take a look at who you really are is really scary. And also kind of asking them to go take a look in the dark abyss and go explore it and don't be afraid. And it's sort of like, it's kind of like, what? That's sort of a bit unfair. It's kind of like when someone goes in, and this is, I think, particularly true of individuals that struggle with attachment and self-identity wounds. It's a bit like you go to a therapist and the therapist says, well, how does that make you feel? It's kind of an unfair question because I don't know, how am I supposed to know that? And because they never had the experience of what is required in early childhood is that experience of imaginatively exploring things in the world and noticing who you are in relationship to them. And that's the creative process. I mean, that is a process of allowing for imaginative exploration and play. And so, well, I don't know who I am. And so I'm a creative arts therapist, so this is the frame with which I bring to the table. But the idea that if you can tap into the aspect of you that can be fluid enough, flexible enough, and playful enough to allow for your imagination to flow, your imagination is probably the quickest and most easiest way to access who you are. I mean, the way that you think about things, the way that and then we're talking about establishing a boundaries as also being something that informs who you are. Part of it too is reframing the way we think of boundaries, because oftentimes individuals who are people pleasers, for example, will experience boundaries as a rejection, or they will experience boundaries as a criticism. And someone says, no, I really don't need you to help me with this. I'd rather do it for myself. Well, I'm just trying to help you. What do you mean you don't want me to be close to you? I'm just trying to engage you. Why you don't love me anymore? This is, it feels as if when someone's like, this is my thing, I got it, you kind of experience as a rejection. And so if that is a boundary, we don't want it because we don't want to do that to someone else. We wouldn't want to make someone else feel rejected or like we don't love them. So not only do we give, but then we don't establish, like when we're feeling exhausted, we don't establish that boundary because we wouldn't want anyone else to feel as abandoned and rejected as we do when someone else establishes that boundary. So part of it is also realizing that boundaries are not your enemy. They're actually your friend. And that unless you can establish those boundaries, you're not actually showing up in your fullest authenticity because you don't know who you are. So if you don't know who you are, how can you be truly authentic in your expression? And this is not a criticism. This is really intended to illustrate the pain that can come along with this kind of structure, because especially in relationships, because you may, and the other thing too that may be a bit of ray of hope is that even if you don't know who you are, the essence of you, the light that you are, the brilliant, bright ball of love, light, and compassion that is your soul and your spirit, and the essence of who you are still shines through. There's, your partner still sees it and they are looking for it and want to have access to it. But when you don't see it for yourself and you don't experience it for yourself, we get lost in the people pleasing or even in the withdrawal or even in the cutting off kind of coping skills because the accessing of that feels so terribly threatening and vulnerable because we don't know what it is and we don't know that it is resilient.
And that I think goes to kind of one of the other questions we had is, what does this earn security? I've never heard that. And this is essentially what it is, right? It's becoming attuned to that inner child, that inner experience, the stuff that you haven't received, and starting to explore creatively and imaginatively to figure that out and to be playful with that, to experiment, to try things out, to notice the discomfort and try to tolerate that and build in that inner resilience that's already there, but actually getting experience and staying with it, which I think you said so lovely.
That's true.
Yeah. And so kind of what might be really helpful is going into now, what is the difference of people pleasing versus courteous reciprocity?
Well, to my mind, the difference is self-abandonment, and self-sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that, to me, it kind of comes to this notion of generosity in a way. A lot of times we think that to be generous requires self-sacrifice, and the measure of your generosity is based upon the measure of how much it costs you. And, my supposition is that generosity is not about self-sacrifice. Generosity is more about abundance. And it's this idea that you are so filled up and you are so fully residing within your own circumference that you just it just spills over. It's this like, it's like attracts like, it's like, I am so filled up with love, light, and compassion. I have so much for everybody and I could never run out. and that's a generosity. When we approach generosity from a place of self-sacrifice, then it becomes a scoreboard above, well, in this case, above the relationship, right? And if you are feeling in the difference between people pleasing and reciprocity, courteous reciprocity, is that it's not like it's not at your cost, right? It's not at your whatever. And even if there is, like, let's say, a material cost, or you have less money or whatever it is, then you don't experience that as a form of, I've negated my needs so someone else can be better off, and therefore I've gained moral points in heaven, like.
Well, it's almost like it's a betrayal of the self, right? There's this sense that for me to be in relationship with someone else must require me to betray myself, which is a betrayal of the needs. And that's that abandonment part you talked about. And what's so important is, that reciprocity it comes from a different place. It comes from this place of, I have needs, you have needs. How do we work on this together? Rather than, I have needs, let me stuff them down. How are you? Let me take care of you. That's a very different type of relationship. It's that, right? That people pleasing is not a mutual relationship. There's not reciprocity because it's not allowed, because that style of relating is, I am only going to give your needs attention and I'm going to neglect my own. Whereas the other one is, hey, let's work on this together.
Right.
And
that's actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, that's what I call, I think of that kind of structure as a guard. So, like, I think of there as being 4 basic emotional boundaries, and guards is one of them. So guards would be someone who has an inability to ask for help, and they also struggle to recognize their own needs. So they don't let other people in, because that confusion leads to a sense of threat. And then that's where we get the heightened anxiety. So when they are when they feel like they are in need, they have a tendency to either withdraw, or they want to give exactly what it is that they are desiring. So for example, they have a tendency to say what they want to hear. They ask what they want to be asked, and they give what they want to receive. So for example, and I think that this is true for individuals that are more avoidantly attached, as well as individuals that are more anxiously attached.
I agree.
So what I refer to as rolling stones or open hearts. So for example, like, an open-hearted guard might have a hard day at work, or maybe, their pet died that day. And so when asked for support, they might downplay their pain and say, well, it's hard, but that's life and I'll get over it in time. It's probably not nearly as tough as what you're going through. So tell me, how am I going to fix your problem? How can I help you fix your problem? Whereas in comparison, a guard or a rolling stone, in my opinion, might assume that when other people are in need, they want to be left alone. So they might say, ooh, tough day, I'll leave you alone, And so, but at the heart of that, usually, whether you are an open heart or a rolling stone, if you have kind of a guard way of dealing with your emotions and your emotional boundaries, you tend to think of boundaries as walls. And so walls are either up or they are down, but they're solid. But fragile. They're kind of rigid, but fragile. And so when we come up against emotional content, either we are flooded with it because the walls are down, and then we merge into them and they merge into us. And in essence, it might be kind of like a high. It might feel kind of like an infatuation in the beginning, like, what do they call it? Love bombing. Mm-hmm. But then eventually you are going to lose yourself in that. It's like a H2O molecule in a wave. And then you need to reestablish yourself. But rather than putting up these kind of flexible cheesecloth, semi-permeable boundaries where you can still be, let's say, interdependent to one another, the rigid stone walls go up again. And it's either we're all in or we're all out. And that's when we start to experience that sense of abandonment. So guards have just decided that it's better to be all out. And so the way that they can somehow get a bit of their needs met is by giving away what it is that they want. It's almost like experiencing things vicariously. And so that's why I really think for people pleasers, it's not the issue. It's almost not even the issue that they give it all away. It's more the issue that they can't let it in.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, you talked about this merging and this loss of self. And I think that's where people get really hung up on is they think they're being connected to these people by extending and opening up the door to hear the other person, but at the same time they're minimizing what's going on for them, which actually blocks intimacy. And the walls they put up put a barrier to intimacy, and the wall being so down and saying, let me be so a part of you that we can't be separate, is also unhealthy. And so the key is, how do we be two unique individuals and stay connected? How do I bring my difficult emotions, and if I had a really hard day and you had a great day, are you going to allow your partner to have a great day and you just stuff all your feelings, or are you going to let your emotions take over and guilt your partner for having a great day? Or can you have those two separate experiences and be together in that? Can your partner comfort and help soothe you and help in a non-invasive way or intruding way to help you calm down and comfort you? And can you also be very like, you did a great job today, I'm really proud of you? Can you have both of that? That is mutuality. And that's what I think in this people pleasing, we kind of lose that.
I would agree with that. I think also too that sort of like people will hear something like that and then they'll be like, oh, but that's not empathic, right? If someone's having a bad day, then and you know, we don't want to make them feel bad by telling them what a great day we had. So I'm not going to tell them. And, you know, or vice versa. Like, I had a bad day and they've had a great day, so I'm not going to share what it is that's going on for me right now. And so I think that sometimes that's a bit of confusion around empathy versus enmeshment. You know, that there's a tendency to think that if when we are feeling the feelings of someone else inside our own bodies, and or you know, we think that it is more loving to sort of abandon ourselves in whatever way to because that's an expression of empathy. It's really usually more a sign of enmeshment. So
can you say what enmeshment is? Can you define that really quickly for people who might not know that term?
Sure. So enmeshment is something that diminishes or dismisses the individuality of another person and tends to perceive any, I'm going to call it contrast, but you might say conflict or disagreement between two people as unempathic. Or if we disagree, then it's an abandonment of this relationship. Or if, right. Or if you disagree with me, then that's a condition of love, right? It's not necessarily a condition of love. It's just that you are noticing where your boundaries lie. And in that sense, you are experiencing, I'm going to call contrast, that is going to allow you to learn more about yourself because you will become increasingly aware of your boundaries. And that's going to increasingly define you. And then you can show up more authentically with your partner because now you know yourself better. And then the work, which I think is, you know, the next step is, okay, well, now that we are these ever expanding bodies, how are we going to negotiate the shared space, psychic, emotional, physical shared space together, right? And I, you know, oftentimes I think a lot of us, especially if we have insecure attachment, have been raised that you can't have that shared space. One person has to abandon the self altogether or dominate all of it, right? And so
well, it's that they don't have the experience that you can be an independent self and connected to another person. Rather, they are taught independence is the only way to survive, or you must be so close and connected and must abandon yourself to survive. Yeah. And so that's the secure attachment is, hey, I see that you're a unique person, and hey, you're in a relationship with me, and this works. Like, I see you and we're connected. But most of us, especially insecure attachment styles, we do not have that experience.
Right. Yeah. And empathy, you know, empathy to my mind is when you are able to hold that boundary, be aware of it. You can be sensitive to someone's feelings. You come home and your partner had a terrible day and you had a good day. Doesn't mean you have to go like, you know, smush it up in their face like some kind of like competitive game. But, you know, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to abandon the good feelings that you have or downplay the day that you had because, because your partner's not feeling well. I mean, I think that there are tactful ways in which you can approach someone knowing how they may be feeling, and that's empathy. But completely abandoning your own experience in service of the other, whatever it is, that's not really empathy. That's a form of enmeshment and self-abandonment. And inevitably that's going to work against empathy because it leads to suppression of feelings. And then you've got a pressure cooker. It's like you're building up resentments, and eventually that will implode or explode.
I agree. And that's the work when I'm working with couples, they often struggle to validate each other's perspectives. And like what I talk to couples is I'm like, we have to have a speaker and a listener. And as a listener, your goal is to validate your partner's perspective. You might not agree with it, but then when you're the speaker, your partner's going to validate your perspective. And it's really hard for couples and each romantic partner to validate something they don't agree with, or something that they have a difficulty understanding the perspective. But that's the part of realizing you are two different people who have two different experiences in the world. And you must have empathy and build empathy for being able to stand in your partner's shoes and say, from your point of view, it makes sense that you would experience something like this, or that you'd see something like this. And then also share your experience, even if it is entirely different, and take those two differences and bridge the gap for connection. And that's where the beauty of the Gottman method or couples therapy really helps bridge that sense of, can we be two separate individuals and connected and work through our problems together? So that's something I want to talk about. And it looks like we got a comment. One of the comments is, can you address verbal abuse in marriage, such as yelling, screaming, and profanities? Overall, the relationship is good until the partner is triggered. Do you have thoughts of that, or do you want me to dive into it?
Well, you being the couples therapist, I would like you to address that first.
So this is what's happening is that your romantic partner, if they are getting this triggered, is they're emotionally flooded. And they need to take responsibility of the words they're saying, the actions they're making, and realize that when they are at that point, they are far beyond their capacity to actually engage in a conversation. And when I'm working with couples where this might come up, is we actually create a flooding ritual where right before something gets that nasty, there's a certain things that happen in the interactions between a couple. And we do a timeout signal, or an all stop, which is we agree to stop this conversation because if it goes any farther, it's going to blow up. And so then they go and they take a 20-minute break where they're thinking what I call relationship enhancing thoughts. And then they come back in a calmer state and start to navigate the conflict together. Now, that doesn't always work. And in that case, the person who's dealing with the partner who is verbally abusive is they must get away from that. And you got to be firm with your partner and say, this is not how I want to be talked to. But no, so I don't want to be talked to this way. And if you're going to choose to talk to me this way, I'm going to leave. And then when you're ready to talk about this and have a dialogue with me, then let's do that. And often what I see is conflict avoidant individuals tend to be the ones that get super emotionally flooded and can be very aggressive, or individuals who are more volatile and their emotions almost are so overwhelming that they just dominate the conversation. And so the key part is learning to self-soothe as that partner, if that's you. And if you're dealing with that partner, set up boundaries that say, this is not a way to talk to me. And if you're going to choose to engage this way, if you're going to choose to bottle things up until they explode on my face, then I can't engage in this. And we have to figure out a new way of dealing with that, whether that means we're going to go work with a couples therapist or a coach, or whether we're going to try to figure out how to talk about this stuff ourselves. What would you add to that?
I was just thinking, wow, there's nothing I would add to that. I think that's a wonderful response. But I mean, I would agree. I think the person is being flooded. And usually, and I would also agree that typically when someone gets to that point, it's because they are struggling with boundaries altogether. And it's likely that they may have some people pleasing tendencies. And one thing I noticed in the comment where they're like, everything's great otherwise, except for this one thing. And it kind of makes me wonder, how great is everything else otherwise within that partner, because I'm wondering if they're spending a lot of time sort of putting on a performance for everything being great and like not really establishing their boundaries all along until they've already reached the boiling point of no return, where it's become that pressure cooker, like I talked about, where things are being repressed, however consciously or unconsciously. And then there's something that snaps, and all of a sudden you have this big argument. And it's like, how and or why is it like this and now and it's great all the rest of the time? Well, it's likely because they haven't actually been 100% honest about their boundaries all along, and they've been like not really honoring them or showing up fully authentically the rest of the time. So you sort of have this illusion that everything's going great, and then all of a sudden there's a big blow up and you're like, where the hell did this come from? And that actually is what happens when people have struggle with people pleasing, enmeshment. All of that typically lends itself to emotional dysregulation at some point as well.
Yeah, and it's like, their positive intent was, if I don't deal with this issue now, if I just stuff it, I'll still have happiness with my partner. But the problem is stuffing those emotions is they don't go away. Psychologists call it emotional leakage. It pops out passive aggressively in other parts of the relationship, or it compounds and it's kind of like a Coke bottle and you drop a Mento into it, some issue that really isn't that big of a thing, and it explodes on the relationship because so much of this stuff has been suppressed and bottled up. And what Briana's saying is that is right. While things seem great, they're troubling. And that partner who blows up needs to learn how to bring up these issues in a calmer way, be able to talk about what they're needing. And typically, that person is conflict avoidant because they're like, well, if I just sweep this under the rug, things will be okay. But the issue doesn't get dealt with. And you as a romantic partner get the aftermath, but don't ever get the how would I put this? The gift of being able to work with your partner on an issue that is upsetting for them to actually make the relationship better so that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so I really love that you brought that into the conversation.
The only other thing I would add to it is that my training at the Amen clinics is sort of popping in, but it's hard to kind of also say necessarily what it is because we haven't done a full assessment. So like one of the things, there's also things you would rule out too. So for example, when I worked at the Amen clinics, we used brain scans to offer diagnostic, feedback. And sometimes individuals would have these outbursts because they had an undetected brain injury, and a lot of us don't realize that you may have a concussion without even realizing it and the impact that has on the brain. And also sometimes individuals have a certain level of activity in different areas. So if someone's quick to anger or be triggered, it's usually because there's some sort of temporal lobe thing that was impacted in some way. So did your partner play sports in high school? Did they have a hard knock to the head at some point? Did they anything? Did they have a car crash and seem to walk away unscathed, but there was some undetected whiplash? Sometimes there are some things like that also go undetected that lead to these psychodynamic things that evolve. And so what may have started with something physical has now become compounded by the way our environment responds to us, the way our partners respond to us, and suddenly our partners react a certain way. Now, aside from just having a brain injury, now we have an internalized cognitive construct that tells us that I am someone who can't control themselves. And then we build a whole narrative and identity around that. So I just would add that I think that, psychodynamically speaking, I think Kyle and I are sort of speaking about something that we've witnessed in our experience. But it's worthwhile also just taking a look at the whole, all the dimensions of experience before we make a diagnostic thing.
Right. And I think that's one of the things I know in my practice. Like I do a full 90-minute session with a couple, analyzing their relationship. Then they take an hour plus assessment. And then I meet with them individually. And then we talk about all the goals. And even then I'm still doing ongoing assessment during the whole process because I'm looking for what are the things that are coming up. And often with partners, especially guys who are the ones that are aggressive, is there's an issue with vulnerability. There's masculinity, there's cultural dynamics, there's family dynamics that need to be explored in a safe space. And when you can do that well, that's where we get some of the changes. And sometimes there are these other physical biological things that are happening within the brain or the body that occur. And there's research that supports that. Like guys from Dr. Gottman's research show that men on average flood much faster than women, especially in conflict. And so the key is then how do we adjust for that? And that's really kind of working on self-soothing, learning to engage, exploring the meaning of conflict, changing conflict styles, a whole bunch of other things that Briana and I have kind of talked about in today. I know we're kind of running short on time. We're kind of getting near the end. And so I want to switch to our last little question, which is, what is the difference between expressing needs and making conditions of a relationship?
Oh, that one could be a whole hour in and of itself.
It could.
So in my mind, it has to do with, like, for example, when someone withdraws physically and or emotionally because you didn't do what they wanted you to do, that's kind of a condition of love. When someone bullies you into being happy with constant people pleasing so they can feel happy and good about themselves is also a condition of love. So you can get, when you can get angry with a partner and you can remain, or let's say, and that partner can remain emotionally present with your anger without tearing down your character or dismissing your feelings or physically abandoning you, then that's an expression of a healthy boundary and a love that is ever present, even though you are arguing, right? And it's also kind of how you both continue to show up in the relationship, regardless of whatever the conflictual circumstance may be. And there's also examples of where you can show up with boundaries in pleasurable moments too. So for example, maybe you're making love and you express a desire for something, or you let your partner know when something's uncomfortable or you didn't like it. And they, in that moment, don't succumb to performance anxiety or shut down and withdraw emotionally because you wounded their ego, right? Then that would be an expression of a healthy boundary, and also a love that is not conditional, that is ever present and willing to acknowledge whatever the need may be in that moment, which is either to stop what they're doing or to change what they're doing because it's uncomfortable, right? But in those circumstances, if we just grit our teeth and bear it because we're afraid if I express this is a need that I have, then they will respond by imposing a condition of love, which is you must enjoy this or I will not love you, right? And so, like, if we were to break this down even further, like, let's say there's a condition. My partner doesn't want to do the things I want to do, right? And so the boundary response might be, well, do I give up what I want or do I honor my desire? And so if there's an over-reliance on conditions, then you might say, I will either sacrifice my desire or manipulate my partner into doing what I want so that the attachment to this relationship is preserved above all else, even if it's emotionally and spiritually dissatisfying. Or these conditions are so intolerable, I'm going to give up everything just to avoid this one thing, regardless of the cost, and throw out the baby with the bathwater. So you see, that's like walls up or walls down, right? And if we get lost in that, we get lost in the conditions and the contrast. It's sort of like, well, this is better than the psychic and or emotional death I'd experience if I were to be abandoned otherwise or taken over, right? And so to my mind, for there to be a flexible kind of preservation of the needs and the desire, along with a love that is not conditional, there you kind of ask yourself, well, is there another possibility that could be equally satisfying for both of us? Are abandonment and complete self-sacrifice really the only answers here, right? And usually it's our fear. We have such a terrible fear of being rejected and abandoned, everyone, and that we jump to those extreme conclusions, and then we start putting conditions on things. I can't love you unless you meet this, this, and this, and this. Right. And also because at the root of it, we all are also absolving ourselves of emotional responsibility. My loving feelings are conditional upon you being this, 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 and this. Right. And so, and because of that, my sense of self is conditional upon you being this, 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 this. So, that's kind of where we end up falling into the conversations we're having right now.
Yeah. So I want to add to this too. This is the, when you're able to honor your needs, you get to figure out the types of relationships and the people that are willing to meet those needs. But what happens is, and one of the troubles I often see couples get into is one partner will be, this is my needs, and so I'm going to force you to try to do that, or I'm going to dominate you or manipulate you to try to get my needs met.
Because I can't be happy unless you meet them.
Right. And that's
because I can't source that feeling for myself. And it's the absolution of emotional responsibility.
Right. Which also leads to kind of really unhealthy relationships, because it's this domineering type of behavior. That's what I would actually code it in the love lab where I work. And it leads to this punishment of that partner. Right. And so it actually reduces the freedom for you to be two different individuals. And instead for you to say, here's what I need. Here's the request I have of you. Are you willing to choose me and do these things, or at least even be flexible and work and give me some piece of it so we can have a better relationship together? Not this, you must do these things. You must be this type of person for me to be happy. Which, as you pointed out, is giving responsibility to your partner and placing it on them. And so that's something that's really important, is to kind of realize, like, am I punishing my partner for not meeting my needs? Or am I making a request that gives them the choice and the freedom to respond and engage in a way that allows both of us to figure out how to make this work? And I think that's a really key thing in terms of the difference between expressing your needs versus demanding and having conditions on it. Was there any more you'd add to that?
No, I think that's a great place to sum it up.
Cool. So let's go ahead and pause here. If you guys have any other questions, I know a lot of you will probably watch this after we record it. Briana and I will be on again next week about the same time. And we will be addressing our next video, which I don't have in front of me right now, but I will post that in the comments of this video, and also let you guys know in the comments of our Facebook group when we'll be talking, and give you guys more information there. Thank you so much for joining us, Briana.
Thank you.
Is there any way, we've done this on the videos, but I'd love for you to summarize. If someone's like, oh, Briana has some of these things that I really need to learn, or I really want to understand more, where would they go, and what would be the best way for them to connect with you or learn more about the work you do?
Well, if you're interested in connecting with me and learning more about the work that I do, you can always check out my website, which is brianamacwilliam.com. And I will also, Kyle, I will give you a link if someone's interested in learning about their attachment style. I have a mini quiz that you can take that can help you start to frame your experiences in that context.
Yep. And so I will also be linking our post that from our first video, and that'll have the link, but I also tag another link in the comments of this video as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will end here.